There we go.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for waiting, and welcome to What You Wanted to Know About Vaccines and Weren't Afraid to Ask. We are a group of research doctors at the St George's Institute research team, and we've got experience of working on lots of different clinical trials of vaccines, including some of the large vaccine trials during the COVID-19 pandemic. If I can start off, if I may, with some housekeeping. We are going to spend the first half of this talk about talking to you about vaccines. Please feel free to ask any questions you might have on the chat, and we will read those and answer those at the end. And please, if we can request that you keep yourself muted. So what you can expect from today's session. So we'll start off by who we are, what we do, and why we are here. We'll then go into a bit of history of vaccines, what is a vaccine, talk through the pathway to approval of vaccines, side effects of vaccines, and then specifically speak about COVID-19 vaccines, vaccination for teenagers, and then open to questions, comments, and discussion. So who are we? We are parents, researchers, and medical doctors trained in adults and children's health. We work in clinical research at the Vaccine Institute here at St George's Hospital in Tooting. We are not employed by pharmaceutical companies, and we work for St George's University. What we're here for. So we wanted to answer your questions about vaccines. This started out as a survey that we sent out to parents via the school, and we got 44 responses from that survey, and we've used those questions and comments to create this talk. Why we're here. So we want to give you information about vaccines, but we're not trying to advertise or persuade, and we really do want to hear your questions and comments. So I will hand over to my colleague now.
Hello.
Get started.
Hi, I'm Tatiana. I'm one of the research fellows, one of the doctors working on vaccine trials for adults. And I'm going to start us off with a bit of background about how vaccines were discovered, what are vaccines and how do they work briefly. So vaccines have been with us for hundreds of years. The history of vaccines really starts with a deadly disease called smallpox. And in this picture, you can see a young baby being vaccinated against smallpox in the 1800s. So for thousands of years, before we even knew that infectious diseases like smallpox were caused by bugs like bacteria and viruses, people observed that there were illnesses that you could catch from other people, and that people who got a mild version of an infectious disease often were protected from getting really sick, from getting the more severe version. And the body seemed to learn to remember how to fight an infection if it had seen it before or seen something similar to it before. And this kind of memory or learning is what makes vaccines possible and what made the smallpox vaccine possible. Introduced vaccines with smallpox with the first vaccine. Over the hundreds of years since that picture of Edward Jenner vaccinating a baby with smallpox, the smallpox vaccine improved, and finally in 1980, the entire world was eradicated. So smallpox was wiped off the face of the earth and doesn't cause illness in anyone anymore, and that was because of vaccines. So how does our immune system fight infections? So here's a picture depicting bugs infecting the body and the immune system fighting them. So when a bug enters the body and makes us sick, the immune system knows that there's something wrong. It knows that there's an invader. It starts to make antibodies. These are represented with these blue Y-shaped things on the screen. And they're special proteins, and immune cells, they're represented in purple on the screen, that recognize the exact bug that is making us sick, and they kill it. And if we recover, those immune cells and antibodies are now trained to remember the bug for the future. If we recover and we meet the same infection again, the immune system knows how to fight it. It kicks into action much more quickly and more strongly than before, stopping the infection in its tracks or weakening it so that we get better more quickly. And a vaccine tries to mimic this process. A vaccine teaches the immune system by mimicking the bugs that cause infections, but in a much safer way than having the actual infection. So that's what vaccines try to do, and there are lots and lots of different types of vaccines. This picture just illustrates some of the many types of vaccines that there are out there, and I'll just describe some of them. So you might get killed or inactivated bugs made into a vaccine. They could be fragments or small pieces of the bug. They can be mRNA vaccines, like some of the COVID vaccines that you may be aware of. And these give the cells of the body instructions to make fragments of the bug. And then the immune system recognizes that and fights against it, and makes antibodies against it. And they can be a weaker or a live version, a living version of the bug. And they all work in a similar way. So why give vaccines? I spoke a bit about smallpox, which we eradicated with the help of vaccines. But the short answer is that they're some of our most effective tools in the fight against some really severe and important infections. This graph illustrates the effect of vaccination on three very serious and sometimes deadly childhood infections: diphtheria, pertussis, and measles. So you've got time going from left to right is the 1900s to today. And the bigger the blob, the more cases of these illnesses. And you can see that after the introduction of the vaccine, and that's illustrated by the syringes, those blobs get much smaller. And what we saw is that cases of all of these important infections went right down. And today we hardly see any cases of these infections. So that's a very, very brief introduction to vaccines. And I'm just going to leave it there and hand over to Professor Paul Heath, who is the director of the Institute, to talk a bit more about vaccine trials.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of the development pathway for vaccines. And along the top there, you can see the traditional pathway for developing a vaccine. And that has traditionally been over at least 10 years, so a long period of time, but a very structured and ordered way of doing it, beginning with designing the vaccine, then often animal studies to show that the vaccine is likely to work. Then there needs to be production of a vaccine ready for the clinical trials. So phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, and Claire is going to say a little bit more about what they are. And then ultimately, the vaccine is licensed. Now, 10 years is a long time, and it's particularly a long time when you're facing a pandemic. So now I'll just mention what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic when we needed a vaccine very quickly. And there were a number of reasons that we were able to do that, and they're shown here. So first of all, it was the recognition that we really did need a vaccine to help control this infection, and we needed it quickly. We were able to develop some of these vaccines because we'd developed similar vaccines before, so there was prior knowledge. There was also adequate funding, and funding is important for all of these studies. Those studies along the top, traditionally it would be that the first study would be done, then more funding would need to be found so that the second study could happen, and so on. So all of that was assured from the start because we all wanted to get the COVID vaccine. So that red tape was cut, as was the red tape that comes with the long ethics committees for each of these stages. We had, during the pandemic, all of the ethics committees were completely focused on COVID-19 vaccines. They didn't focus on anything else. So that meant they were able to review things in real time. We also had lots of teams, like the team here at the Vaccine Institute at St. George's, ready and willing to devote all of their time to doing the studies. And finally, and most importantly, we had lots of people who wanted to participate in the studies. So in the UK, we know at least 500,000 people put up their hands and indicated that they wanted to participate in clinical trials. And that was so important in doing these trials. So it meant that we were able to start with a vaccine design and finish with a licensed vaccine within the space of a year. We did all of the steps. The same steps were done as we always did do with vaccine development. But as you can perhaps see, there was some overlap between some of these steps. So, for example, vaccine was produced in large amounts even before we knew it was going to work. And the risk was that it wouldn't work and all of that vaccine was to be thrown away. But that risk was worth taking. And it was things like that that led to the licensing of a vaccine and the use of a vaccine, which, as we all know, has been so important within a year. I'm going to pass now to my colleague, Claire.
Hello, my name is Claire. I am a paediatric doctor by background, and I'm currently working as a research fellow here at George's. And I'm going to talk briefly about side effects. A lot of questions that we got related to side effects, which is understandable. And I suppose we wanted to point out that all vaccines and medicines have some side effects, although not everybody gets them. And we just need to continuously balance these side effects against the benefits of the vaccine or the medications in preventing illness. How do we monitor side effects? Well, safety monitoring takes place in all phases of the clinical trials, but it also continues once a vaccine has been approved for use in the general public. So I'll talk a bit about the phases of the trial, of any trial. Paul touched upon them already, but phase 1 of a trial involves a small group of healthy people, so it's usually less than 100 people. And the whole point of this phase is to look at safety. So we examine the safety of a new medicine and we check for side effects. There's a number of ways we might do this. It might involve regular blood tests or regular check-ins or reviews with a doctor, or it might involve daily or weekly diary entries from the participants, and they report any side effects or symptoms or any issues, however small, and those entries get collected and reports are made. If all is okay, the trial progresses on to phase 2, which involves a larger group of people. It's usually several hundred people. And although the main aim of this phase of a trial is to compare this new medicine or vaccine against an existing treatment, we continue to monitor the side effects. If the medicine or the vaccine passes phase 2, it goes on to phase 3, which is again a much larger scale involving several thousand people. If all is okay, the vaccine becomes approved and it can be licensed, and then it's available on prescription. But the safety monitoring doesn't finish there, it continues on. One of the ways we do that in the UK is through a yellow card scheme. So this board, called the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, is the main authority in the UK that monitors side effects. And the yellow card scheme is something that's available to everybody. So members of the general public can go on the internet, they can just Google yellow card reporting, and you can enter any medicine, any vaccine, and detail any side effect that you've experienced. And then the MHRA collect all these reports and then they issue guidance accordingly. And interestingly, with the COVID vaccines, there were about 2 yellow card reports for every 2,000 doses administered. And looking more specifically at the side effects reported with the COVID vaccines, the most common ones by far and away were things that we would expect to see, like headaches, muscle aches, sore arms, high temperatures, tiredness. And as they said, we would expect to see these things as they reflect a normal immune response to by the body to the vaccines. They were slightly more frequent in younger adults. And interestingly, also during the COVID vaccine trials, over a third of placebo recipients, so these are individuals who didn't receive the vaccine but received a tablet or an injection. Well, in this case, it was an injection that contained salt and water and didn't contain any active ingredient. Over a third of those participants experienced the same side effects, which was interesting at the time. So I'll hand over to David, who's going to talk more specifically about the side effects.
Thanks, Claire. I'm David. I'm one of the research fellows at the Vaccine Institute as well. And I thought that following on from what Claire was saying, it might be interesting for you to see an example of what would be a phase 3 COVID vaccine trial. So this is the larger trial to see if a vaccine works. So this is an example of a large COVID vaccine trial that was done right at the start before any vaccines were available. And these are the results that might be generated from such a trial. So there's 43,000 participants in this trial, and half were given the trial COVID vaccine, and half were given a placebo, which was, as Claire explained, an injection of salt water. Most of the main constituent of somebody's body is salt water, so it's a completely benign thing to give. And then what happened in this trial was that they monitored people to see who got COVID and how bad it was when they got it in the two groups of people, those who got COVID vaccines and those who didn't. And they also always monitor for safety, and they call this looking out for adverse events. So the graph on the screen there with the blue charts, so you can see that the amount of COVID in people who had the COVID vaccine was much lower than those that did not over the 112 days that they were monitored. And that with that number of people and that difference, you could then say that the vaccine is very effective at preventing illness from COVID. And then on top of the blue bars, there's some very thin slivers of orange, which is the number of people who had an adverse reaction to the vaccines, which is a smaller number, but you can see is actually equal between the two groups, those given placebo and those given COVID vaccines. So from that, you could conclude that the vaccine is really quite safe, because just as many adverse events happened to the people who received your vaccine than did not. So that's how a phase 3 COVID vaccine might work, and those are the results that you might get from it. So that doesn't mean that the COVID vaccines don't cause any problems at all, and some that you might have seen reported are reports of blood clots or perhaps inflammation of the heart, known as myocarditis. So I thought I'd just walk through some of the numbers about these side effects and how a COVID vaccine or COVID itself might be involved. So if we looked at out of 10 million adults in a time before COVID, then out in 10 million adults in a year, you might see 8,000 blood clots for other reasons, and you might see 2,000 cases of heart inflammation in those 10 million adults. If COVID was present in a group of people that had not had vaccines, then the risk that it would add to those 10 million people would be an additional 13,200 blood clot cases, or 500,000 cases of myocarditis of varying severity. So COVID itself increases the risk of these conditions quite significantly. Then if we looked at the vaccines themselves, what that would do is reduce your risk from COVID significantly, and from the vaccine itself, you would only expect an extra 66 cases of blood clots or 700 cases of myocarditis. So although the vaccine isn't risk-free, it defends you from a large risk from COVID infection having not had a vaccine. And those numbers are all well and good, but if you're trying to think about risk, often it's helpful to think about the odds of something happening. So here I put the odds of unvaccinated COVID infection versus if you've had a vaccine. And so your risk of a blood clot having would be 2.6 to 1, or of having heart inflammation 185 to 1, with the odds being in favour of having a vaccine to protect you from those conditions. So I'm just going to hand over now to my colleague Tash to talk about COVID vaccines for young people.
Thanks, David. So yeah, my name's Tash. I'm another one of the research doctors at St George's, and I mainly work on children's studies. And I just wanted to talk about what the current COVID-19 vaccine recommendations are for children and young people. So some of you might be wondering why you can't go and get your children and teenagers vaccinated against COVID-19 whenever you'd like to. And I just want to talk about why the recommendations have changed through the pandemic and what they are at the moment. So the JCVI is the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, and they're an independent committee of experts who collect evidence together so that they can advise the government on which vaccines are needed, who needs them, when they're needed, how well they work, and lots of other things. And through the pandemic, this committee has looked at the up-to-date evidence from lots of different places, including hospitals and labs and published research. And depending on what that data showed, they've either advised the government, yes, you should vaccinate children of this age group, or no, you shouldn't. And as we know, things changed really quickly through the pandemic, and so the advice changed often as well. So at the beginning, children and young people weren't really recommended to take their vaccines because they weren't at such high risk of COVID infection as older people. But as we collected more information and data, children with underlying health conditions were recommended to have their vaccines. And then eventually it was advised over time that all children and young people should be vaccinated. And we'll talk more about what factors were weighed up in making that decision. So from this year, as of January in 2023, only children in an at-risk group should be offered a COVID vaccine. So universal vaccination of children and young people is not currently recommended. And what that means is that at the moment, you can't go and get your children or teenagers vaccinated unless they have some sort of specific underlying health risk. And just before Easter of this year, the age range has actually been extended. And so from teenagers all the way down to babies of around 6 months and upwards, if they're in an at-risk group, they would be advised to take a COVID vaccination course. So let's look at some of the factors that this expert committee considered across the whole course of the pandemic and why things might have changed as time went on. So first of all, they would be thinking about how serious is COVID for children at the moment. So how sick do children get with COVID, or how many children need to go to hospital and how many children need to go to intensive care? And who is the worst affected of those children? So which age groups and which underlying conditions make children more at risk of COVID? And you need time to collect that information and that data, which is why things have changed through the pandemic. And the other thing that's changed is the variant. So what variant is currently circulating? How does that affect children? Is this one more severe or less severe than the previous variant? So what are the side effects of the vaccine in children? And are those any different from side effects that we see in adults? And another important thing they thought about was about whether vaccinating a child would prevent onward transmission to, for example, a vulnerable adult. If we spend time vaccinating every child in the country against COVID, what impact will that have on the routine vaccinations that we give? And as we know, those are really important. How do we balance missing days from school? So do you need more time off school from having your vaccine, or do you need more time off school from having a COVID illness, for example? And then they also thought about balancing all the other costs. So what were the costs to time off education? What were the social costs? And what were the health costs, for example, to children having a COVID infection or being admitted to hospital? So you can start to see why things were complicated and why things might have changed through the pandemic. And it wasn't really always a clear-cut decision one way or the other. And it was sometimes quite a hard choice to make. But I think throughout the pandemic, this committee has always said that their most important aim has always been to prevent severe COVID in children and young people. And that was the most important thing that they were thinking about. So I'll hand over to my other colleague, Alberto, now, and we'll move on from COVID and start talking about some other vaccines.
So I'm Alberto, one of the adult fellows working in this team. And I wanted to cover some of the vaccines that are given to older children and teenagers in school age. Why do we give these vaccines? And now, some of them are given because there are people at risk at that age, like the flu vaccine, for example. Some of the vaccines are given to boost immunity to the vaccines that were given when they were babies. Other vaccines specifically target a virus to protect against cancer, like the SGVI that we'll cover shortly. And then sometimes we want to vaccinate at the time where the disease is more prevalent or you're more likely to have it. And in this case, teenagers have an increased risk of meningitis, which is why we vaccinate them at this age. So moving on to specific vaccines, we want to talk about the HPV vaccine, which is a vaccine against the human papillomavirus, which is a common cause of cervical cancer in women, but also oral cancer and warts. Two of the types, so type 16 and 18, are responsible for most of the cancer, actually. And it's actually one of the commonest cancers in young women under 35 years of age. We have a vaccine that is quite effective. As you can see on the graph on the right, as the years go to the right, the rates of HPV, so how much HPV is present in the population, has dropped as a result of the vaccination. This vaccine was first introduced in women only. It's given as 2 doses. More recently, it's also given to young men. One, because they will prevent women from getting it because they won't pass it on if they're vaccinated, and also because they will also be protected from oral cancer and all the conditions. So again, one proof that we can prevent disease with vaccines. Similarly, with the meningitis vaccination, so meningococcus is a bacteria that causes both meningitis and septicemia, which are very serious life-threatening conditions. It affects both very young children, babies, and adolescents. And babies do get some vaccinations against meningococcus, but not all the groups are covered. So there's several groups that can cause disease. In this case, this vaccine that we give now protects against group A, C, W, and Y. And again, it's a very safe vaccine. It's not a live vaccine, so it cannot cause meningitis itself. And it's been used for many, many years as a travel vaccine. So it has an excellent wealth of safety data because it's used in travelers who go to Africa, for example. And finally, I want to talk about the nasal flu vaccine that is given as a spray in the nose compared to the injections that the other two were. And this vaccine is a live vaccine, so it contains a live form of flu virus, which has been weakened, so it won't cause disease when you get the vaccine. However, this vaccine can only be given to those who have a normal immune system, because otherwise it could be at risk. And we had specific questions about the gelatin that this vaccine contains. The gelatin is derived from pork and is used as a stabilizer. And we wanted to address this question as well. So why do we put it? We put it in there to ensure that the vaccine remains stable when it's stored, so it won't degrade if it's in a shell for a long time. Why can't we have another vaccine without it? As my colleagues have already covered, the process of developing and licensing a vaccine is very lengthy. And once you select a stabilizer and you start the process, if you were to change any of the components of the vaccine, you have to start from scratch, which means that it's a very costly and lengthy process, which is why it's not done. Fortunately, we have alternatives. There is an inactivated injectable vaccine that is not as effective, but it's an alternative for those who don't want to have the nasal one. And obviously, this is a concern for Muslim and Jewish communities. However, the religious authorities have been consulted about this fact, and both have concluded that because they're not food, they are a medicine and they're not given by mouth, they are actually acceptable to use according to their religious laws. So we wanted to obviously address these questions, and I think that we're coming to the end of our presentation as such. I'm going to pass you back to my colleague Isha to cover the last bit of the talk.
Hey, thank you, everybody. I hope that's been helpful. So for more information on infectious diseases, vaccines, and the research trials that we conduct here at St. George's Vaccine Institute, please do follow our Twitter and our website. The addresses are below. And if anybody wanted to consider joining one of our trials, there's a Healthy Volunteers database to hear more about the studies that are open currently, and you can access that by scanning that QR code. So that brings me to